The Latin poet Virgil composed his epic, the Aeneid, between 30 and 19 BC. In the poem, the hero Aeneas escapes the destruction of Troy and eventually lands in Italy, where his descendants are destined to found the city of Rome. Along the way, he falls in love with Dido, the queen of Carthage, but eventually abandons her to fulfill his destiny. A heartbroken Dido stabs herself upon a funeral pyre, invoking a curse for the centuries to come. Then, as for you, O Tyrians, plague this stock, and the whole race to come with hatred, and send this service to my ashes. Let there be no love, or treaties between our peoples. This is how Virgil retrospectively imagined the origins of the rivalry between Rome and Carthage, an enmity which unleashed the 3 Punic Wars. In this video, we will cover the major events of the First Punic War, the young Roman Republic's first true military trial outside the peninsula. Previously, this series on the First Punic War was only available exclusively for our YouTube members and patrons. Asterisk, you can join their ranks to watch more than 200 exclusive videos covering every era of history, including 21 episodes on the Second Punic War. All links in the description and pinned comment. Asterisk, between 282–275 BC, the Roman Republic fought a victorious war against Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, in a bid for supremacy over southern Italy and its Greek-founded cities. During that conflict, Rome had been allied with the Carthaginians, whom they referred to as Punici or Punics due to their Phoenician origins. Carthage had a strong presence in Sicily, a prized possession of their empire, including much of northern Africa, southern Spain, Corsica, and Sardinia. And a decade later, Sicily would be the main battlefield upon which these erstwhile allies would do battle. The first tiles of the vast mosaic of the First Punic War were laid back in 288 BC after the death of Agrigentum, tyrant of Syracuse. His unemployed mercenaries of Italian Campanian origin decided to seize for themselves the city of Messana, modern-day Messina, on the doorstep to mainland Italy. In their brutal occupation, they expelled or massacred all male inhabitants, divided amongst themselves the women and children as slaves, and branded themselves as Mamertines, the sons of Mars, the god of war. Their reign of terror dragged on until 264 BC, when the new ruler of Syracuse, King Hieron, armed and trained his citizens' militia and moved against them. Hieron clashed with the Mamertines at the Battle of the Longinus River, inflicting a heavy defeat upon them. The Mamertines retreated to Messana and were put under siege. Fearing destruction, the Mamertines realized they needed allies. But who? One party among them advocated for an alliance with the Carthaginians, whilst another faction preferred to involve Rome instead. Soon, a request for help from the Mamertines reached the Roman Senate. Part of the assembly favored the intervention. Helping the Mamertines would have prevented Carthage from occupying Messana, a position from which they could have threatened mainland Italy. The debate was inconclusive, but the popular vote tipped the balance in favor of the alliance. Following this, a 20,000-strong army under Consul Appius Claudius was dispatched to Sicily. The main expedition was preceded by an army legate, also called Claudius, who was shocked to discover that Messana was teeming with Carthaginian troops and ships. Indeed, the Mamertines had eventually dispatched requests for help to both Rome and Carthage, and the Punics had got there first. Claudius, the legate, resolved the situation by speaking to the Carthaginian admiral, Hanno, inviting him to a conference. But at Wassatrap, Claudius took Hanno prisoner and offered to free him only if the admiral ceded control of Messana's fortified citadel. The Mamertines immediately switched allegiances, electing the Romans as their new saviors. This did not go well with the Carthaginians. A second force, led by a general, also called Hanno, promptly switched sides as well, and forged an alliance with King Hieron of Syracuse. To recap, Legate Claudius held Admiral Hanno hostage in the citadel, while the Mamertines in Messana now braced themselves for a double-pronged attack, with General Hanno laying siege from the north and Hieron from the south. Armies of that age surely knew how to pull a Mexican standoff, or whatever this mess of a siege was. The situation was saved by the arrival of Consul Claudius, with the bulk of the Roman army. What they lacked in fantasy when picking names, the Romans more than compensated for in heavy infantry tactics. After a failed mediation attempt, the Romans quickly defeated the Syracusans, then turned north to face Hanno. The Carthaginians were also beaten in the field, and the Romans raided and ravaged the countryside before moving toward Syracuse. Despite all this, Appius Claudius' siege of Syracuse did not result in an easy victory. It dragged on into 263 BC, with King Hieron having to do little but turtle behind his walls, whilst Mylae did a splendid job of keeping the Roman soldiers in check. Eventually, the annual term of Appius Claudius' consulship ended, and he was relieved by the new consuls Ottocilius Crassus and Maximus Messala, who brought along fresh reinforcements, 16,000 footmen and 1,200 cavalry. the Roman army retreated back towards Messana, followed closely by the Hieron, however, noted that whenever opposing scouting parties met in the field, they not only did not fight one another, but actively fraternized with each other. Feeling that the tide of public sympathies was shifting towards the Romans, the king of Syracuse switched sides once again, becoming a staunch ally of the Republic and agreeing to pay a tribute of 200 talents. With their rear secured by their new friend, Crassus, and Messala launched a successful campaign against General Hanno. The Carthaginians were defeated in the field at the Battle of Mylae, a display of Roman prowess which prompted 67 towns and cities previously under Punic control to ally themselves with Rome. The initial Roman campaign had been a success, with the Carthaginians now driven back towards the western half of Sicily and Rome firmly in control of the northeast. Carthage, however, was resolved to put up a strenuous fight. In 262 BC, command of land operations was entrusted to Hannibal Gisco. Unlike the Romans, the Carthaginian army relied heavily on mercenaries and allied troops rather than conscripted or volunteer citizens. Hence, following the defeat at Himera, Gisco needed time to raise a new army, recruiting mercenaries from northern Africa, Spain, Gaul, and Liguria. A force of 50,000 troops assembled in the city of Agrigentum, near Sicily's southern coast, and Gisco stocked up on weapons, supplies, and provisions. His tactic was to draw the Roman army into a set-piece battle, which he could wage with the advantage of an easily defensible position and overwhelming forces. The Roman Senate took the bait and dispatched an expeditionary force under the two consuls of the year, Lucius Postumius and Quintus Mamilius, expecting an easy victory. The consuls only brought 2 legions under their command. After setting camp, they thinned out their already scant forces by sending out large foraging parties. Gisco immediately realized his tactical advantage and ordered a sortie to wipe out the Roman encampment. His hopes were dashed by the remaining sentinels, who offered a fierce resistance and died to the last man. The bitter fight allowed for the foragers to return to camp and to fight back the Carthaginian sortie. In the following days, Gisco displayed more caution, limiting his actions to harassing the Romans with missile bombardment. Meanwhile, the legionnaires expanded their quarters by building 2 separate camps, connected by a double line of parallel trenches and ramparts. One line, closer to the Agrigentum, protected the camp from Carthaginian sorties. The other guarded the Romans against any attack from the rear. Consuls Postumius and Mamilius also set up an efficient logistics system by ensuring constant resupply. From the nearby town of Urbacis, north of Agrigentum, 5 months passed without decisive breakthroughs on either side. The supplies of the besieged party, however, were dwindling, and Gisco sent a request for help. The Carthaginian Senate dispatched General Hanno with a new army, which included 6,000 Numidian cavalrymen and 50 elephants. Hanno set up his headquarters in Heraclea, from which he proceeded to take Urbacis by surprise. The Romans now had been cut off from their supply lines, and were squashed between Hanno's hammer and Gisco's anvil. The besiegers were now besieged, and soon famine and diseases started to take their toll. Postumius and Mamilius realized that their position was untenable and ordered their soldiers to prepare for battle. They would attempt a breakthrough against Hanno's forces. General Hanno laid out his soldiers over 2 lines, the heavy infantry at the front, and the reserves and elephants on the second line. The formidable Numidian cavalry guarded the wings. Contemporary sources do not provide details on the Roman order of battle, but presumably, the consuls in charge adopted the 3-line formation typical of the manipular legions. Also, the cavalry protected the Roman flanks, which were the first units to engage the enemy. This is when the Romans realized the superiority of the Numidian light cavalry. Fast, agile, and skilled at javelin throwing, the Numidians were able to pick off the Roman horsemen from a distance before charging and driving them off the battlefield. The Carthaginian infantry, on the other hand, was no match for the Romans. Postumius and Mamilius maniples clashed head-on with Hanno's first line, pushing them back towards the second line. At this point, a second, smaller Roman force managed to surprise the Punic formation from the rear, sowing panic amongst the elephants, who trampled Hanno's own troops. 30 pachyderms died in the carnage, but the Romans managed to capture 11 of them. As per Hanno, he was forced to order a hasty retreat back to Heraclea to save what remained of his army. The consuls now turned to face the second Carthaginian force, Gisco's garrison within Agrigentum, but the crafty commander was a skilled escape artist. It seems, taking advantage of a dark and cold winter night, he had his soldiers file out in silence out of Agrigentum. Carrying bags stuffed with straw, the Carthaginians filled the deep trenches of the Roman siege works, scaled the ramparts, and eventually passed through the sentries unobserved. In the early hours of the morning, the Romans discovered they had been tricked and, quite possibly, bamboozled. Some units of legionnaires gave chase, but they were soon recalled for a more pressing matter at hand. the storming of Agrigentum, the city was effectively defenseless, and the inhabitants surrendered immediately, but they had to withstand the horrific treatment reserved to places taken by storm. The Roman soldiers plundered the riches of Agrigentum and seized 25,000 prisoners to be sold into slavery. The Battle of Agrigentum was the first major engagement of the first phase of the First Punic War, fought entirely on land. Its consequences were momentous, as both Hanno's and Gisco armies retreated to the western end of Sicily. More and more towns and cities on the island pledged allegiance to Rome. The Carthaginian fleet remained active around the island. From its bases of operations on the west coast, the threat of incursions from Carthage's navy thus prompted several coastal cities to defect back to the Carthaginians. Still, theoretically, the war aims of the Roman Republic had been achieved. They had saved the Mamertines from destruction, had secured a new powerful ally in Syracuse, and had driven the Carthaginians away from Messana, and therefore mainland Italy. But it was at this stage that the Roman Senate understood the occasion they had chanced upon, the opportunity to evict Carthage from the central Mediterranean for good, and to maintain lasting control of the rich and fertile island of Sicily. But to achieve total victory, Rome had to change strategies and theater of operations. In 261 and 260 BC, Rome had the advantage on land, while Carthage dominated the sea. These tactical advantages represented a strategic stalemate for both contenders. The Romans could field numerous well-equipped, skillfully led legions to mount an invasion of Carthage itself, but had no fleet to take them there. On the other hand, the Carthaginians boasted a powerful navy, manned by experienced sailors, but lacked the skilled troops and leadership needed to invade Italy. The question was, who would fill their gaps first? As it turns out, the Romans were not entirely inexperienced in sailing. A class of magistrates, the duumbri navales, had even been instituted to oversee repairs of Rome's fleet of triremes, used mainly for coastal and anti-piracy operations. These ships, fitted with 3 rows of oars, were nonetheless too small and too few to take on Carthage's mighty fleet of quinqueremes, which boasted 5 orders of oars. Clearly, the Republic had to develop their own quinqueremes, but how? To acquire the necessary skill, a gift of Neptune, or a simple stroke of luck, assisted the Romans when a Carthaginian vessel ran ashore on the coast of Calabria. Roman engineers used the shipwreck as a model for their own According to Polybius, in barely 60 days, Rome and its allies on the coasts of southern Italy had constructed 100 quinquiremes and 20 triremes. Such a fleet required 12,000 marine soldiers and, more importantly, 30,000 trained rowers to be operational. This was achieved by training the rowers even before the ships had been completed. The magistrates in charge had wooden scaffolds erected in beaches, which replicated the internal structure of the vessels. Roman and Italic trainee oarsmen sat on the scaffolds and practiced the art of rowing in unison, following the commands of the calousts. However, what the Romans could not learn in the short time available were the complicated maneuvers required to ram an enemy ship, the main naval tactic of the time. What the Romans did learn, however, was how to brace a ship for impact, therefore absorbing and limiting the impact of a ramming attack. Roman engineers developed a new weapon based on this principle, the corvus, a mobile bridge fitted with a beak-shaped metal spike. Once a Roman quinquereme was flanked or rammed by the enemy, the corvus would be lowered onto the other vessel, thus connecting the 2 ships, and by using a rotating contraption which affixed the corvus to the main mast. This mobile bridge could be lowered in any direction. A party of marines would then march across the corvus, engaging enemy sailors in close-quarter combat. Thanks to the corvus, the Romans effectively took what made their soldiers so deadly on land and made it applicable in naval combat. Rome's new fleet and tactics would soon be tested. In 260 BC, the fleet was put under the command of Consul Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, who immediately set sail toward Messana with a squadron of 17 ships. On his way, Scipio decided to make a detour and occupy the Lipari Islands. Home to a small Carthaginian garrison, the consul reaped an easy victory. But news of this Roman assault soon reached General Hannibal. Gisco, headquartered in the Carthaginian stronghold of Panermus. Gisco immediately dispatched 20 ships under Admiral Boudet, who, sailing at night, arrived undetected and blockaded the port of Lipari. The inexperienced Roman sailors lost their nerve and scurried to mainland Sicily. A terrorized and impotent Scipio could do nothing but surrender. Command of the Roman fleet was thus transferred to the other consul, Gaius Duilius, who was clearly a better naval commander. Having learned that the Carthaginians had been raiding the peninsula of Mylae, he set sail toward them. The Carthaginian fleet, led by Hannibal. Gisco himself, numbered 130 quinqueremes, which, on parchment, should have easily disposed of the 100 hastily built ships of those Roman ups. Bursting with confidence, they fell upon Duilius' vessels without even taking formation. 30 Carthaginian ships rowed ahead, aiming to ram an equal number of Roman ships head-on rostrum to rostrum. The Italic oarsmen held fast and absorbed the impact as they had been trained to do, then Duilius sprung his trap. The corvi fell upon the Carthaginian timbers, grappling their bridges with 30 iron raven beaks. The Roman marines immediately lined up on the mobile bridges and launched their attack against the unprepared Carthaginian sailors. 20 of Carthage's ships took a different approach and charged sideways, port to starboard, aiming to break the Roman oars. But they were in for another surprise when the monstrous corvi rotated 90 degrees and plunged their beaks equally efficiently. In some cases, the enemy ships were so close that many Romans didn't even walk the mobile bridge, but simply leaped over the parapet onto their enemy's ships. The Carthaginian fleet had lost 50 of its queen quiremes, locked in a deadly embrace with their supposedly inferior enemy. Gisco ordered for the remaining 80 ships to steer off Mylae, and then headed to Sardinia to regroup. Emboldened by the victory, Roman land forces in Sicily marched over Segesta, very close to the Carthaginian holdings. The Romans then embarked on another maritime expedition, this time targeting the other two large islands controlled by Carthage, Sardinia, and Corsica. The fleet was now led by one of the consuls for the year 259 BC, Lucius Cornelius Scipio. He was the brother of Gnaeus, who had been eventually defeated at Lipari. More importantly, he was the grandfather of Publius Cornelius Scipio, called Africanus, who would take a pivotal role in the Second Punic War. Scipio sailed first towards Olbia, the Carthaginian capital in Sardinia, but the city's defenses proved too strong, and the Roman navy was repelled. The Romans were more successful in attacking Illyria, the main Carthaginian garrison on the island of Corsica. Scipio returned to Rome at the end of the year for a well-deserved triumph and handed over admiralship to consul Gaius Sulpicius. In 258 BC, Sulpicius chased Hannibal Gisco's fleet all the way to southern Sardinia, and their two fleets clashed near Sulcis Tyrannica. The Romans managed to surround Gisco's fleet while moored, sinking most of its vessels. It was one defeat too many for the Carthaginian general. His own men mutinied against his command, arrested him, and eventually crucified him, a frequent fate for losing Carthaginian commanders. To achieve these victories in Corsica and Sardinia, Rome had dispersed its forces, and the Carthaginian forces in Sicily would take advantage. The new commander at Panermus, Hamilcar, seized the day when the Romans partially withdrew from their recent conquest of Segesta. He chased the departing legions and ambushed them in Sicily, would take advantage. The new commander at Hamilcar seized the day when the Romans partially withdrew from their recent conquest of Segesta. He chased the departing legions and ambushed them in their camp at Himera, slaying 4,000 enemies. He then moved westwards, falling upon Eryx allied to the Romans, destroying the city and imprisoning the inhabitants in the nearby fortress of Drepanum. A Roman army under consul Aulus Atilius sought retribution, aiming straight at Panermus. However, Hamilcar had reinforced the city's defenses, which discouraged Atilius from even attempting a siege. Atilius attempted to draw out Hamilcar for a pitched battle, but the Carthaginians did not take the bait. Atilius then decided to seize minor, yet important enemy centers. First, his legions marched over Hypna, and then they took Mytistraton after a brief siege. As per custom, the city was sacked and burnt to the ground, and its citizens were massacred or sold into slavery. The consul's next target was Camarina, on the southern coast of Sicily. Whilst on their march to the south, Atilius' troops had to walk through a narrow mountain pass, where a Carthaginian contingent ambushed them. A small Roman detachment, consisting of 2 or 3 maniples, led by a tribune, held the enemy off, whilst Atilius led the bulk of the column to safety. The self-immolation of the unknown tribune and his troops was not in vain, as the consul added Camarina to his string of conquests. The following year, 257 BC, saw the election of another consul from the gens Attilia Gaius, Attilius, Regulus. The new consul had just landed in Tyndaris, when he dove straight into the action. From the coast of Tyndaris, Regulus observed that a Carthaginian squadron was sailing past without maintaining any specific formation, making it vulnerable prey. Attilius gave the order to attack, and before the bulk of his fleet could be readied, he set sail at the head of a squadron of 10 quinquiremes. The Carthaginian commanders realized that most Roman vessels had not left port yet and steered towards the small incoming squadron. The Carthaginians outmaneuvered the Roman ships, surrounding them and destroying them in ramming attacks. Only the consul's ship managed to escape the impalement, its oarsmen frantically rowing towards the coast. Only at this stage did the remainder of Attilius' fleet finally leave port and come to the rescue. The Roman ships arranged themselves in a line and challenged the enemy head-on, using the well-rehearsed corvus tactics. 8 Carthaginian ships were sunk, 10 were captured, and an unknown number escaped to safety on the Lipari Islands. Despite some teething problems, the Roman Republic had been able to adapt, evolve, and quickly master the art of naval warfare. In several significant engagements, the Roman fleet was on par with the Carthaginians. arguably the finest shipbuilders and sailors of the Western Mediterranean. Rome's Senate and its military leaders now felt confident enough to dare the unthinkable, build an even larger fleet and mount an expedition of epic proportions that would take the fight straight into the Carthaginian homeland. According to ancient historian Polybius, by the summer of 256 BC, the Romans had assembled a fleet of 330 quinquiremes in the port of Messina, as well as an unspecified number of vessels for the transport of troops, animals, and supplies. Each of the quinquiremes was manned by 300 rowers and 120 marines, which puts total Roman manpower at least 138,600. The fleet then sailed southwards, doubled the Cape of Pichinus, and then veered westwards, heading to Cape Ecnomus. Polybius states that the Roman land forces happened to be just in that neighborhood. Presumably, one or more legions were due to embark in preparation for the invasion. Unbeknownst to the Romans, the Carthaginians headquartered at Panormus became aware of the plan and rallied an even larger fleet, numbering 350 vessels manned by 150,000 sailors, which is roughly the entire population of modern Tallahassee, Florida. Their combined force left Panormus, stopped at Lilybaeum, and then dropped anchor at Heraclea Manoa. From their anchorage at Cape Ecnomus, the Romans prepared themselves for the crossing towards northern Africa. The consuls in charge, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius, knew that their ships were slower and less maneuverable than their enemies. Thus, they conceived a formation to provide maximum protection for both the vessels and the cargo. They stationed their own enormous hexareme galleys at the very front, each to be followed by one squadron, following a diagonal line. This gave the formation the appearance of a large wedge. The consuls then placed a third squadron at the base of the wedge, thus closing a triangle. This squadron was also in charge of towing the transport ships, vital for the invasion's success. Finally, a fourth squadron of vessels described by Polybius as triarii closed the formation, arranged in a line behind the transports. Back in Heraclea, the Carthaginians were steadying themselves for a major battle in the open waters. Their leaders, Generals Hamilcar and Hanno, addressed their forces, stressing the importance of a victory. If they emerged triumphant, they could aim at retaking Sicily. If they lost, they were bound to fight for the very existence of their homeland. With their spirits galvanized, the Carthaginians sailed eastwards, ready to quash the Roman invasion in its inception. When Hamilcar and Hanno came into view of the Roman fleet, they gave dispositions for their squadrons to attempt an encirclement maneuver. 3/4 of their vessels arranged themselves in a single line, their bows facing the Romans. Their southernmost squadron, led by Hanno, extended to the open sea, ready to pivot in a pincer movement. The northernmost squadron, under Hamilcar, was slanted at an angle towards the coast, ready to close the pincer from the north. Regulus and Manlius took notice of the incoming enemies and of how thin and extended their main line of battle was. Aiming to break the center of their formation, the consuls ordered for their two squadrons to row forward at speed. The Carthaginian ships immediately retreated westwards, prompting the enthusiastic Romans to charge even faster. However, this Carthaginian withdrawal was part of Hamilcar's plan to extend and eventually break apart the Roman formation, a plan which worked perfectly when the Roman rear squadrons and the transports were left isolated at the rear. When the Carthaginian center had drawn off the consuls' squadrons far enough, Hamilcar released a signal from his ship. The Carthaginian galleys all turned simultaneously and charged back at their pursuers. A colossal naval melee ensued as each faction fought how they knew best. The Carthaginians outmaneuvered and outflanked the Roman ships, ramming into their sides with their rostra before quickly disengaging and taking on the next target. On the other hand, the Romans made good use of their corvus, the lethal mobile bridge fitted with an iron beak. Once a dropping corvus hooked a Carthaginian ship, the Roman marines swiftly crossed the bridge, disposing of the enemy crew. Regulus and Manlius also actively stormed enemy ships and incited their men to fight with more vigor. At the same time, Hanno's squadron had swung northwards as intended and was facing the fourth Roman squadron, or triarii, gaining the upper hand. Further north, the Carthaginian squadron closer to the coast had pivoted southwards, falling upon the third Roman squadron. To increase their speed, the latter vessels let go of the ropes, towing the transport ships, which remained stranded. Amidst the three separate engagements raging around them, the main fight pitched the consuls against Hamilcar and was initially evenly matched. But the Romans had an advantage. Their fleet had been conceived as a landing expedition. Therefore, they fielded more heavy infantry compared to the Carthaginians, which gave them the edge in close-quarter fights. Eventually, Regulus and Manlius' forces had the upper hand, and Hamilcar ordered his ships to disengage and sail westwards. Manlius' squadron then rounded up several enemy ships as prizes, whilst Regulus ordered for his vessels to row east, going to the aid of the triarii and the transport ships. Regulus' squadron veered north, thus attacking Hanno's squadron from the rear. The morale of the Triarii was boosted by the sight of the consular ship and went on the attack. Hanno was now crushed between two lines of ships and narrowly escaped to the open sea. This left only one Carthaginian squadron on the waters of Ecnomus. This division was closer to the coast, which had engaged the Roman Third Squadron, pushing it closer and closer to the shoreline. The Carthaginians, however, did not attempt decisive ramming action, as they had observed the effectiveness of the corvi at closed ranges. This allowed Regulus and Manlius to close in on the enemy from two separate directions, thus forming a perfect encirclement. Only a handful of Carthaginian ships managed to escape the three-pronged attack, while 50 vessels and their crews fell into the hands of the Romans. The largest naval battle in antiquity had come to an end with a clear Roman victory. In total, 680 warships had been deployed by both sides, manned by almost 300,000 men. Rome had captured a total of 64 galleys and sunk more than 30, thus eliminating almost one-third of Hamilcar's and Hanno's fleet. The consuls had lost 24 ships sunk and none captured. The bulk of the invasion force was intact, and there would be no obstacles from Ecnomus to North Africa. The invading force under Regulus and Manlius swiftly sailed across the Mediterranean, landing at the Hermian promontory at the northeastern end of the Bay of Carthage. From there, the Roman legions proceeded south, towards the city of Aspis, which they took after a short siege. Meanwhile, what remained of the Carthaginian fleet had returned to their home city to warn the local ruling senate. As the Romans were expected to attack immediately, the capital's defenses were strengthened, but Regulus and Manlius had other plans. In the days following the conquest of Aspis, their soldiers systematically plundered its rich and fertile lands. The Romans drove vast herds of cattle into their camp, ransacked farms and palaces before setting them on fire, and finally abducted 20,000 inhabitants of the countryside to be sold into slavery. This wealth accumulation may have prompted the Roman Senate to issue an unexpected order. Lucius Manlius would return immediately to Rome with the war booty. Regulus would be left in charge of operations in the Carthaginian territory, with 40 ships, 500 horsemen, and 15,000 soldiers. Shortly after Manlius' departure, General Hamilcar returned to his homeland with 500 cavalry and 5,000 foot. In consultation with the other two generals, Hasdrubal and Bostar, he resolved to crush the Roman threat, but Regulus maintained the initiative. From Aspis he marched his soldiers some 100 kilometers to the east and prepared to attack the city of Atis, the antechamber to Carthage and its bay. The Romans surrounded Atis with their siege works and raided the countryside for supplies. Seeing an opportunity to target their foraging parties, the three Carthaginian generals deployed their own army near the besieged city. Numerically, their forces were roughly equal to the Romans, but the locals could boast too.